Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Now, I've been doing TypeScript development for over a decade now. And in that time, I've written a lot of TypeScript code, but I've also converted a lot of JavaScript code into TypeScript. And let's just say I've learned a few things. In this video, I'm going to show you the things that I've learned, and I'm going to walk you through how to convert your existing JavaScript applications into TypeScript. But this is the second video in a two-part series. So if you haven't seen that first video where I talk about what TypeScript is and why you'd want to use it, why don't you pause this and go check that video out first. The link is in the description. Once you have seen it, then what are we waiting for? Let's get started. This is my code. It's a simple JavaScript project. I've got a folder that has the UI in it and a server. So on the server, I've got an Express API. So I'm using Express here. I've got my in-memory database of users, and I've got a couple of endpoints. So now, if you don't know Express, if you've never seen this stuff before, don't worry about it. I mean, it's just, it's an API. So I've got a few endpoints here. So if I get my users, I retrieve that list of users. And then here is the endpoint where I create a new user from the request body. So I'll get into this a little bit later once I show the code. On the UI side here, I've got just some standard HTML and some standard JavaScript. So I'm not using any fancy UI frameworks or anything. This is just regular DOM. So I've got a fetch operation to get my data, and then I just go ahead and render that data using DOM APIs. So let's see this application in action. If I switch over, we can see I can order users by create date, by type. And I can even add a new user. So user 1, my age 432, okay. So that one got added. Now if I try and add an employee, I actually have an error. Missing required fields age. So now as I'll show you in a little bit, and from the first video, you'll know that a user, a regular person, requires an age, but that's actually not in a field on the employee object. And so this is a validation error that we're actually going to fix just by converting this application to TypeScript. All right, now back to the app. So the first thing I'm going to do to convert this application to TypeScript is I'm going to install TypeScript. So what does that mean? I'm going to use npm install TypeScript. So in this package is going to come the TypeScript compiler, or TSC, and I can see that by using npx TSC. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run -- init. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a basic tsconfig.json file for me. And so this JSON file contains all of the configuration that TypeScript needs. So there's a lot of stuff in here. Don't get too overwhelmed by this. Like, I've never even used any of these guys, and I've only used probably about half of the rest of these settings. So I'm going to go over a couple of these important settings in this video, and the rest of them you can kind of learn as you go along. So don't get too overwhelmed by it. So just by adding this tsconfig.json file to my application, to my project, and I'm running VS Code here, VS Code picks this up and says, oh cool, we've got a TypeScript project on our hands. But right now I've only got JavaScript files, and I can tell TypeScript, and therefore VS Code, to start checking JavaScript files if I enable this check.js option. So if I save this, check.js true, if I look over here right away, I start to see things lighting up. So if I jump in here, I can see that VS Code is actually highlighting a bunch of these errors for me. So what are these errors? If I hover over them, I can see object is possibly null, user fields does not exist on type, and parameter event implicitly has an any type. So we'll look at these first actually. It's yelling at me about this implicit any type. So what is the any type? it basically means that TypeScript has no idea what type this is. So I talked a lot in the first video about how powerful TypeScript's type inference is. In other words, it can actually look at your JavaScript code and it can figure out a lot about your code. If you create a variable and initialize it with a string value, then that variable is a string type. But what it's saying here is you've just created a function, you've defined a parameter. I have no idea what this parameter is, so it could be anything. That's actually an error by default. And so what we're going to want to do when we're first converting existing JavaScript applications over is we're going to want to reduce that noise, and we're going to turn these errors off, at least for now. So we're going to jump down to no implicit any, and we are going to disable that. So it's kind of a double negative here, but what this is going to do is it's going to eliminate those errors. They're still there, right? We still get these 3 dots here. So they've turned into warnings or informational things for us, but at least they're not errors anymore. So we can focus on kind of the real arrows. So let's talk about these. So let's see. Object is possibly null. What this is saying is that TypeScript is saying, when you run this function, document.getElementID, the possible return types are HTML element or null. And now you're just running add event listener on this. If I bring this onto the same line, it's a little bit more obvious, right? And TypeScript is telling me that's no good. It could be null and you need to check for that. I'm not going to just let you call a function on top of that without checking for it. So in this case, I'm going to use the JavaScript coalescing operator, this question mark here. This is JavaScript, by the way. It has nothing to do with TypeScript. This is a JavaScript operator. And what this does is it basically says, if this return value has a value, then go ahead and run the rest of this line. Otherwise, don't. Just skip it, right? And so that error goes away. Where did this come from, by the way? Now, this is interesting. If I F12 into this and view the definition for this, we can see we're on line 7346. So there's a lot of type definitions here. Where are these? These are in that node module that I just installed. So in here, we actually have the type definitions for a bunch of different things. ES 2017, 2019, all the different versions of ECMAScript. Along with what we're looking at here, the DOM or web workers scripts. So these are just out of the box, everything that TypeScript already knows about and can tell us about. And so it knows that the getElementById returns an HTML element. It knows that document.querySelector returns an element. So what are these errors now? Let's take a look at these. User list is possibly null. Another one of those null errors, same problem. I'm using getElementById, it can be null. But instead of just using the coalescing operator here, because I've got multiple references of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some logic, and I'm going to say, if we didn't get a user list, then return. Just get out of this function right here. I'll make it a little bit prettier, right? So get out of the function. What just happened? These errors went away. So this, again, is TypeScript inference, actually looking at my code, looking at the logic of my code, and saying, if the 2 possible values of user list are HTML element or null, and then I check for null, and if it's null, then I return, then logically, for the rest of this function, it must be HTML element, and we're good. If I scroll down here to my last error, we have the same problem, right? Except it's sort select. I'll just copy and paste. There we go. We're good. So I've solved those issues. Let's jump back to these 2 issues here. It's the same issue, right? Here, I am using document query selector to find this element, the name equals type, and then retrieve the value from it. What is this referencing? This is referencing this select box here, right? Name equals type. And because it is a select, it's a drop down, it's going to have that value attribute. I know that. TypeScript doesn't know that. As far as TypeScript is concerned, this is going to be either an element or null. It might not find anything. This query selector might not match anything, so it's not going to let me do that. Okay, I'll use that same trick on both of these, and I'll shut it up. But now I have a new error. Property value does not exist on type element. So not every DOM element has a value attribute. Only those field elements do, the selects and inputs and all of those. And I can't be sure, or rather TypeScript can't be sure, that this is a form input just by this query string. So what are we going to do? Let's refactor this and create a new method. And then call this method from both of these things. All right, so the error went away. All I did was move things around and the error went away. Why is that? Well, I just kind of confused TypeScript here, right? So if I look at this, it says, well, I don't know what parameter. Again, it's that any issue. You didn't tell me what type of parameter this is, so I don't know what the return value is. More specifically, if I pass this into here as any, it doesn't know what the return value is. And that's going to roll up, and that's going to be the return value of my function. So the way that I can fix this is I can use that JS doc. So I'm actually not going to convert this particular file, this index.js, to TypeScript in this entire video. I'm only going to use JS doc to fix these issues. So right here, I can use JS doc and define the type of my parameter as string. And the moment that I do that, now TypeScript is able to figure out, okay, well, if you pass a string, then the return type is going to be element or null. So we're back to where we started, but we're a little bit further along. I can override what it's telling me. So it's saying element or null, but I'm going to override that. And so when I call this, I'm actually going to say that it returns an HTML form element or null. So I've overridden what the TypeScript definition is. I'm saying that I know this will be an HTML form element. And as soon as I do that, my errors go away. All right, so I've got one more error down here. Object from entries. Property from entries does not exist on type object constructor. Do you need to change your target library? Try changing the lib compiler option to ES 2019 or later. See, this is a great example of not only does TypeScript tell me that I have a problem, as much as possible, it actually tries to give you some suggestions of how to fix your problem. So here it's telling me, try changing the lib compiler option to ES 2019 or later. Okay, let's check that out. So we'll go over to the compiler option, and it's talking about this option right here. So what this is telling me, and if I change this to ES 2019, we can jump back, and we have new issues. We've addressed that issue, but we've introduced this new issues. What did we do here, though? What was it telling me? Well, TypeScript is a syntax. It's a language. The TypeScript compiler takes your TypeScript code and emits JavaScript code. The target property here, the target compiler option, tells us what version of ECMAScript we need to target when we output that code. So is it ES 2016? Is it ES Next? That's what I usually do, ES Next. So that's the syntax that is emitted. What this lib option tells us is what libraries are available to us. So by doing this, this is saying I am targeting the ES 2016 syntax. That's what my JavaScript is going to look like. But I do have access to the ES 2019 libraries. And I also am living in a DOM and iterable and, blah, 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 blah. I can add whatever I want in here. And now, where is this form data? I don't know where this form data is, but you know what? I don't generally like to do this. What I like to do is actually just change my target to ES 2019. So I'll change my target language, and by doing so, that actually changes the libraries that are available to me. So it wasn't just ES 2019, it was also a handful of other things which form data is a part of. So now we have access to that because it was available when the ES 2019 spec came out. So once we target that, now we have available all of those libraries. And we've now fixed this file. We're done with this file. I'm going to leave it alone. All right, now that we've fixed our JavaScript issues, let's move over to the server side and our server application. And this file I am going to convert to TypeScript. So in just a minute, I'm going to rename it to .ts, make it a true TypeScript file, and convert this thing all over to TypeScript. But before I do that, let me just show you a couple of things. So if we look over here, we'll see that TypeScript is giving us a warning that it could not find a declaration file for module express. So what's a declaration file? I showed that previously with the DOM. So TypeScript comes with built-in declaration files for the ECMAScript libraries and the DOM libraries and everything, but it doesn't know anything about Express. Specifically, this Express NPM module does not provide declaration files in it. Now, because TypeScript has been around for over a decade, most packages, now I don't actually know the stats for that, I'm just making this number up, but most packages, in my experience, actually include TypeScript types in the package. So you don't have to do what I'm about to show you for most things, but for some older packages or packages that just don't like TypeScript for whatever reason, you're gonna have to do this. And what we're doing is try npm install savedeb types express. So what this is saying is try to install the types for this package from this other npm package @types/express. What is @types? It's actually a Git repo, a community supported Git repo that anybody can commit to and provide type information for libraries like Express. Whenever they commit to it, it creates these npm packages and publishes these packages here. So now we've gone from not knowing anything about Express to having that full type information for it. We can do the same thing here with this cores library. And we can even do the same thing while we're at it for Node itself. So Node does not have type declarations that come with it, so we can install it. So we have more information about Node. So like if we scroll down here, we can see process.env. This is a Node thing, right? And so we get full type information about that. All right, now we've installed these types. And again, when I hover over this, you can see I'm actually getting this autocomplete and everything on my JavaScript files, right? It's not that great, but it is a lot better. Let's make it even better by converting to TypeScript. So finally, we'll rename this to .ts. And then also, I am going to copy over some pre-made modules that I've already done, so you don't have to watch my bad typing. I'm just going to copy them over, and then I'll walk through them. So we'll open up this model.ts file, and what we see here is I've created a couple of interfaces. So I've got a person interface and an employee interface. Both of these extend or inherit the same base user interface. So they all have, or they both have a username, create date, and a type of string, and they add their own properties on top of that. So for a person, you have an age, and for an employee, you have a title. Now, note here, I'm introducing something new. In the base definition of base user, type is a string, so it can be any string. But here I'm saying that a person always has the literal string of user. And likewise, an employee always has the literal string value of employee as their type property. So employees will always have the employee name type, and then employees will always have a title. So in other words, any user that has the type property as the string employee will have a title. We'll treat that as an employee. It won't ever have an age. It'll have a title. Then on line 17 down here, I create an alias using that type keyword called user, so I can refer to a person or an employee as a user. And then these last couple of lines are some validation fields. We'll get into it later, but what this does is it gives me all of the field names, the property names for both types of person and employee, and then I build a validation object out of that. So this is a record object that has all of the property names that I want to validate. So type, age, username, create date, title. And then each of the values of those names are Boolean or undefined. So basically, I'm going to use this later on to validate my user as it comes in. I'll show you that when we get to it. But before I do that, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to use these new types right here on my users array, my in-memory database, as it were. So I need to first import from model. So I'm importing this type. Now, this is an ES6 import, and I'm kind of I'm coexisting here with these requires. That's okay. TypeScript will deal with that later. I can also use this type keyword here to say, I'm not actually importing any code from this module. I'm actually just importing types. So TypeScript knows when it comes to convert this to JavaScript, just go ahead and delete this line altogether. But for now, we actually have that type information. So we're saying this is a list of users. This is an array of users. And if we look down here, we've got two errors that have been highlighted. This first one says, object literal may only specify known properties, and age does not exist in type employee. How does it know it's in type employee? Well, I said it was an employee, right? And so if we hover over here, we can see this whole object is an employee and it has a title, and that's a string. But employees don't have age. That's not a thing, so that's an error. Cool. If we jump down here, we get a similar error. Type uppercase user is not assignable to type user or employee. Did you mean lowercase user? Why, yes, I did. This is calling out the fact that I made a mistake in typing this, and it is not it's not lowercase user as it's supposed to be, as this one is, which is totally fine. It's got an uppercase U, and if I fix that, hey, cool, everything's fine. So that takes care of those errors. Now, if I jump down here to where I'm actually creating new users. So this is my post. Whenever I post to this API endpoint, my request body is going to have a JSON object that has all of the data to create this new user. I can tell TypeScript about that in two ways. Here, Copilot is telling me already. I'm just going to hit tab. I can cast this object. So this object is any. I can cast it as a user, which will make this variable a type user. Or I can do what I'd done previously and just kind of explicitly set it there, right? Either one of those will work. But I like to cast it. Now when I come down here, I'm creating a new user. This is that object that I'm going to build up here. I'm going to do a bunch of validation. I'll get back to this. We can see there's already a couple of errors that TypeScript has found for us. If I had any validation errors, then go ahead and return a 400. Reject the request, don't go any further. Otherwise, at this point, go ahead and add that new user to the list of users because it is a user. So I'm going to, again, cast this here. So we're good there. Scrolling back up, I also want to have this strongly typed too. I don't want to add any properties that are not available to a user or use wrong types or anything. So I'm going to say this is a user that I'm building up, but that's an error because I haven't given all of the properties yet. So actually what I really want to do, because I'm building up this object, I want to make it a partial user. So it's only part of a user. And so now I can add properties, right? If I try and add something here, you know, a property that is not defined on the users, that's an error, right? But these guys are fine. Now, my valid field. So this is that validation object that I talked about. I'm going to use this, right? So what this is going to be is a record. And remember, a record is just kind of defines a JavaScript object in memory. And so the first type parameter is the property names of this record. And that's going to be new user fields. And then all of these are going to have Boolean values. So it's going to be an object. All of the property names are going to be names of new user fields, and then it's going to be true or false whether they're valid or not. I get a similar error here. Hey, you didn't provide every single property name yet. Yeah, I know. That's fine. So I'm going to make that partial because like my new user, I'm going to be building this up as I go. So now we're good. All these errors are gone away. We can move on. We've seen that we have a check on the type here. We know we can only accept person or employee because this is a user, and that's the intersect here. So now we get into body type equals employee. Same error that we had before. It is an uppercase E, not a lowercase e. So when I change that, now we see a couple of the errors go away. But let's undo that real quick and see what were these errors here. Property title does not exist on type never. Now, what is the type never? We talked about any. That is, can be anything, right? It's like the JavaScript dynamic type. So what is never? Never is TypeScript telling us, based on the information that I know, this can never be any type. Like, this is completely illegitimate. You know, this is not a scenario that can happen. And so then when I fix this and it says, oh, wait, hold on, I know. This is an employee has a title. Okay, we're good, right? I finally do know the type. And then we're left with this issue here. Property title does not exist on type partial user. It only exists on an employee. So we're going to use that casting again. Just for this one time, we're going to cast this new user as an employee so that we can, with strong typing, assign that property value of title. We'll do the same thing here with new user, except we'll cast it to a person. And of course, we need to import the person type. And now a person has an age. We can set that. We're all good. Now, also check this out. I showed this in the first video, but I'll show it again here. TypeScript is looking at the logic of our code. We've got an if-else condition here. The body can only be a user. A user can only be a person or an employee. If the body type is an employee, in other words, the body is an employee, then else, when we get into here, the body must be a person. Those are the only two logical things that it can be, and TypeScript has figured that out for us. We didn't actually have to tell, I didn't have to explicitly say this, right? It figured it out by itself. Oops. And that's it. Now I've fixed all of my errors, and we can go ahead and try and run this application. Let's see what happens if I run node server index.ts. All right, so now it's come time to run our application, but Node doesn't actually understand TypeScript, right? So if we go back to our browser file here, our index.js, I didn't convert this to a .ts file. I didn't add any typing outside of these JS docs. So these are comments. And so this code will run just fine in the browser because the browser will see these comments and say, oh, that's just a comment. I don't care. That's not code, right? It's not going to break anything. But because I converted this server-side file into a .ts file and Node doesn't understand that, I now have to convert it back to JavaScript. The easiest way to do that is to use the TSC compiler. So I'm going to, again, run npx tsc, and I'm going to say .p, and then period. So I'm going to say run the TypeScript compiler against this current project, this folder, and all of the JavaScript code in it. And so what this is going to do is it's going to read everything, and it's going to output the JS right next to the TS. I also have an error here, cannot write file index.js because it would overwrite the input file, right? So what it's saying is I type check this index.js, but instead of actually outputting it and rewriting it, I'm just going to skip that. That's an error. But for these guys, I read the TS file and I wrote out a JS file. So we can see this is that ES 2019 compatible JavaScript code. And so now my node will run again, right? So run server index.js, that runs fine again. But obviously we don't want to do this. We don't want to have this JavaScript right next to a TypeScript. Generally you want to have some kind of output folder, right? So we're going to run tsc.p and we're going to give it the outdir parameter. So we're going to say compile our code, but put the output into a new folder called dist. And if we look here, we actually see that it's copied our project structure, right? So our tsconfig.json file lives in the root of this folder here that includes both of these. And so it's reading all of them. And when we compile them, it kind of retains that output structure. So here we can see our index.js. This is that ES 2019 code. And this works as well. So if we say dist now, server index.js, there's our application running. Now, this works perfectly well, obviously. But ironically, the TSC TypeScript compiler is actually the slowest option that you have for compiling your TypeScript code to JavaScript. Why is that? Well, it's actually the best option for discovering type information and type errors and things like that, doing the type checking. But that is also the reason that it is so slow, because the TSC compiler loads all the types and checks them and makes sure everything is good before it gets to that step of emitting the actual JavaScript. It actually takes a long time. That's really slow. And so because TypeScript has been around for so many years, a lot of the tooling has caught up and actually natively supports TypeScript. So I would highly recommend that you don't do this. Obviously, I showed you that this obviously works. You can do this. This emits perfectly acceptable production code, but usually you're going to want to use some other tool chain like your Webpack or Vite or some other tool that you're already using, and use that to produce the JavaScript from your TypeScript files. Now, the one little caveat to that is, maybe while you're developing, you might want to have a development server and not have to compile. Well, there are a couple of tools for that. So one of them, the most popular, is TS Node, right? So instead of just node, it is ts-node, and we can point that directly to our TypeScript files. TS Node understands that and runs that. Now this was quick because I previously installed this, but it might take you a little while to download that the first time you run it. Likewise, we have TSX. So this is just an alternative to TS Node, but same deal. We point it to our TypeScript file. It runs our server for us. So these tools have, I'm not going to get into them here, but they have, watches and everything for local development. It's not really recommended to run these things in production, but for local development, they are a really good option. And that's it. We've now converted this application from JavaScript to TypeScript. Now, even though this is a pretty simple application, what I've shown here are the same steps I've used to convert a bunch of JavaScript applications to TypeScript. So you should be good to go just using what I showed you. Also, that is the end of this two-parter, but don't worry, there's plenty more TypeScript content on the way. So if you're looking to build up those skills, be sure to like and subscribe so you'll be the first to see them when they come out. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.